A woman, while buying a coffee farm, saw a photo in a picture frame of someone very special to her who disappeared 25 years ago and was left in shock. Natalie, a very successful woman, was on yet another business trip. She had one mission: to buy more coffee farms to expand her empire. But even with all the prestige and fortune she had gained, Natalie no longer found joy in life. Her days were full of meetings and important decisions, but she was tired, uninterested. It wasn't because of the work, but because her heart had closed off many years ago. 25 years earlier, Natalie was engaged to Christopher, the man she loved more than anything. They were about to get married, to start a life together. But suddenly, he disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye. Natalie searched for him, waited for answers, but never got them. The pain of his disappearance, of that loss, was like a wound that never healed. Now, even with all her fortune and professional success, Natalie felt a deep emptiness. All her travels, all the farms she bought, all the deals she closed didn't fill the space Christopher had left. She still remembered the day he left, as if it were yesterday. It was a memory that haunted her thoughts, as if part of her had stayed frozen in that moment. While on this trip, heading to another farm, Natalie sighed, looking out the car window. "It's funny," she thought to herself. "I got everything I ever dreamed of except what really mattered." The pain of Christopher's absence never went away. Natalie lived with the pain of loss every day. No matter how many years had passed, the feeling of abandonment was as strong as on the first day Christopher disappeared. She always wondered what could have happened. Did he leave her on purpose? Did something happen to him? These questions never left her mind, and it was unbearable for her. Sometimes Natalie would find herself staring into space, remembering the happy moments they had together. She remembered Christopher's smile, their conversations, the plans they made for the future. But instead of feeling joy with these memories, she only felt deep pain, a pain that squeezed her heart and left no room for anything else. "I never understood why he left," Natalie thought, her eyes filled with sadness. "If only I knew the reason. If only I had answers." This feeling followed her wherever she went. It was like a shadow that never gave her peace. Natalie decided to stretch her legs and walk a bit after a long day of negotiations. The farm she was at was simple, surrounded by trees and coffee plants that seemed to stretch as far as her eyes could see. She walked slowly, looking around, but her mind was still lost in thoughts of the past. As she walked, she spotted a young man in the garden of one of the nearby farms, crouched down, tending to some plants. He seemed focused on what he was doing, carefully working the soil. As she got closer, Natalie decided to strike up a conversation. "Hi," she said, trying to sound friendly, although her voice was heavy with exhaustion. "Do you work here?" The young man stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked to be about 20, with a calm smile and a curious look. "Yes, I do." "My name's Aaron," he replied, extending his hand to greet her. "And you? Just visiting?" Natalie shook his hand and smiled slightly. "I'm here on business at the farm next door. I'm Natalie, but I thought a walk would be a good idea." Aaron nodded, but before he could say anything, Natalie continued, "Do you like working here?" "I do," he answered simply. "I grew up in this place. My adoptive father runs this farm, and I help him whenever I can." She looked around, taking in the simplicity of the place, and something about Aaron's calm manner made her feel at ease. "It's a beautiful place, peaceful," she commented, still unable to shake the heaviness in her heart. Aaron smiled again. "It is. Sometimes I think that's what brought my father here. He always says the peace here helped him find a new path." Aaron, seeing that Natalie was interested in the farm, kindly offered, "Would you like to come in and have a coffee? We don't get visitors here every day." Natalie hesitated for a second, but something about Aaron's simplicity and kindness made her accept. Why not? A coffee would be nice. They walked together to the house. It was a modest but cozy place. As she entered, Natalie smelled fresh coffee mixed with the scent of old wood. Aaron asked her to make herself comfortable while he went to prepare the drinks. Natalie then began to look around. It was a simple house but full of small details, like photos and objects that told stories of those who lived there. Suddenly, Her eyes stopped on a photo hanging on the wall. Time seemed to stop in that moment. She moved closer, almost unable to believe what she was seeing. It was a photo of her, taken from behind, sitting on a swing with a mountain in the background. That image brought back a flood of memories. It was the same photo Christopher had taken of her 25 years ago, on a special day they had spent together. Natalie felt her heart race. "How can this be here?" she murmured in disbelief, lightly touching the photo frame. She remembered that moment exactly. Christopher had the camera in his hands, smiling as he said, "Stay there, Nat. Don't move. This will be our special photo." She had laughed at the time, gently swinging, feeling the breeze on her face, never imagining that it would be one of the last happy moments they would have together, on that swing, with that mountain in the background. Christopher had taken that photo, cherished it so much, and now it was here, in a stranger's house. Aaron returned with 2 cups of coffee and noticed Natalie standing in front of the photo. He put the cups on the table and walked over. "That photo caught your eye?" Natalie, still dizzy, looked at him. Where did you get this photo?" she asked, her voice almost failing. "That's me in the photo. Exactly like that. In the same place. 25 years ago." Aaron smiled slightly. "Oh, that one. My dad put it up there many years ago. He always talks about it like it's a treasure, a big mystery. He spends a lot of time looking at it. I didn't know you were the person in the photo." Natalie stared at Aaron, still trying to piece together the puzzle. She needed answers, so she asked, her voice a little shaky. "Aaron, are you sure it was your dad who took this photo? This is a very special moment for me. How could he have taken this photo?" Aaron paused, confused by what this meant to Natalie, but answered sincerely, "Yes, I'm sure. My adoptive dad always spoke fondly of this photo. His name is Chris. When I was a kid, he told me many times about the day he found this photo among his things, and he always felt very happy looking at it. I never asked many details, but he seemed to really like it." Natalie's heart raced even more. Chris, the name sounded far too familiar, but she didn't want to jump to conclusions. Deep down, her instincts were already telling her this couldn't be a coincidence. She looked again at the photo, trying to control the flood of emotions threatening to take over. "Chris," she repeated softly, almost to herself. Then she turned to Aaron and asked, trying to stay calm, "You said he's your adoptive dad? How did he end up here?" Aaron shrugged, not realizing the weight of these questions for Natalie. "He arrived at the farm many years ago. From what he told me, he went through an accident and lost part of his memory. The only thing he remembered clearly was his love for photography. That's how he ended up here and started a new life, and after a while he adopted me." With every word Aaron spoke, Natalie felt like the ground was slipping from beneath her feet. Could this be her Christopher? The man she had searched for all these years? She needed to know more. She needed answers. She turned to Aaron, her heart racing, and asked, trying to control her voice, "This your adoptive dad, is his name Christopher?" Aaron, a bit surprised by the question, answered simply, "Yes, actually, his full name is Christopher, but everyone here on the farm calls him Chris." In that moment, Natalie's world seemed to stop. The name, the photo, everything made sense, yet it was too unbelievable to be true. She was standing there, possibly facing an answer to the mystery that had haunted her for 25 years. And if the Chris Aaron spoke of was really her Christopher, the man who had disappeared without a trace, she had to hold herself together to not show the storm of emotions she was feeling. "Aaron, do you think I could meet your dad?" she asked, trying to sound calm, even though inside she was in complete turmoil. Aaron smiled, unaware of what was going on inside Natalie. "Of course, he'll be back tomorrow. If you'd like, you can come here again and talk to him. I'm sure he'd love to meet you." Natalie could only nod, her heart beating far too fast. She didn't know if she should allow herself to believe that this was possible, but a small spark of hope began to grow inside her. 25 years ago, Christopher had disappeared without a trace. Natalie remembered that day clearly, as if it were yesterday. They had made plans, dreamed together about the future, and then he simply vanished. There was no goodbye, no explanation, nothing. Just the emptiness and the pain of not knowing what had happened. She had been desperate. In the first months, Natalie did everything to find him. She hired detectives, posted ads, traveled to other states in search of any clue, but all she found were closed doors and silence. The disappearance happened in another country, during a business trip Christopher had taken. He had gone to take care of some important matters, promising he would return in a few days. But he never came back. Natalie spent the first few years of his absence searching for answers, traveling through cities and even remote villages, but it was as if the earth had swallowed him. There were no clues, no final trace she could follow. As the years passed, Natalie's relentless search began to take a toll on her life. She threw herself into her work as a way to push the pain away. On the outside, people saw her as a strong, successful woman who had it all. But inside, Natalie was broken. She had never truly been able to move on. Even when she told herself it was time to leave the past behind, a part of her always wondered, what if he's still out there somewhere? Now, with this new possibility in front of her, Natalie felt a mix of hope and fear. After all, what if the man Aaron called his father was really her Christopher? The man she had searched for all these years. Natalie took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but inside everything was a mess. The possibility that Chris could be her Christopher was an idea that wouldn't leave her mind. She knew she had to return the next day, that she couldn't miss this chance. It was the opportunity to finally discover the truth after so many years of pain and uncertainty. I'll come back tomorrow, yes, Natalie replied, her voice a bit shaky but trying to sound firm. I really need to talk to him. Aaron smiled, unaware of the complexity of the moment for Natalie. It'll be a pleasure. My dad's a good man. I think you'll get along. Natalie thanked him and said goodbye, walking back with a heart heavy with emotions. As she left the farm, her mind was in a whirlwind of thoughts. Could it really be him? And if it was, would he remember her? Or was it too late to recover what they had lost? That night Natalie barely slept. The thought that the next day she might finally have answers made her anxious, but also filled with fear. The next day, Natalie returned to the farm with her heart racing. She had hardly slept that night, anxious and full of thoughts. When she arrived, Aaron was outside, tending to the garden as he had been the day before. When he saw her, he smiled and waved. "Hi, Miss Natalie. My dad's home now. He just got back," Aaron said, gesturing towards the house. Natalie's heart felt like it was about to leap out of her chest. She took a deep breath and, without saying a word, followed Aaron to the door. Every step she took felt heavier. She didn't know what she would find, and the fear of disappointment mixed with the hope of finally getting an answer after all this time. When Aaron opened the door and called for his dad, Natalie felt her legs tremble. She entered the house, and there he was, Christopher. An older man with graying hair and a calm expression, but still the same face she had loved for so many years. For a moment she was frozen, unable to say anything. The air seemed to disappear from the room. Christopher was there, just a few meters away, but there was something different in his eyes. He didn't recognize her. Christopher looked at Natalie and smiled politely, not knowing who she was. "Hello, I'm Chris. Aaron said you wanted to meet me." His voice sounded so familiar, but there was a distance, something that broke Natalie's heart. She had found him, but he was no longer the same. Natalie, with a heavy heart, took a photo out of her bag that she had kept for so many years. It was a picture of her and Christopher, together, smiling on a happy day, long before everything changed. She handed the photo to Christopher, her hands trembling, hoping he would recognize something, some trace of the past. Christopher took the photo, studying it carefully. His eyes squinted slightly, as if he was trying to remember something he couldn't quite grasp. He looked at Natalie, then back at the picture. There was a faint sense of familiarity on his face, as if he knew this woman meant something, but he couldn't understand what. I feel like I know this person," Christopher said, pointing to himself in the photo. "And you seem so familiar, but I can't remember. I don't know from where." Natalie's heart ached at those words. Seeing Christopher standing there, right in front of her, without remembering everything they had shared, was more painful than she had imagined. Still, she took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. "Christopher, we were engaged," she said softly, but with emotion in her voice. We were about to get married before you disappeared. I spent years looking for you." Christopher looked at her, confused, but with a small spark in his eyes. It was as if he wanted to remember, as if a part of him knew that this woman standing before him was part of his life in some way. But the memories remained locked away, far out of reach. I'm sorry, engaged?" he said genuinely. "I wish I could remember, but I can't." Natalie held back her tears, seeing the man she loved still so distant, even though he was right there in front of her. Christopher looked at the photo again, still trying to understand who he was in that picture. He sighed and began to speak, his voice calm but filled with sadness. "I don't remember much about my past. All I know is what I've been told. Many years ago, I woke up in a hospital not knowing who I was. They said I had been in an accident, but I didn't remember how or where it happened. I didn't even know my name properly." Natalie listened to every word carefully, trying to piece together his story with what she knew about his disappearance. "An elderly man visited me in the hospital," Christopher continued, his eyes distant. "He told me I owned a small farm and that he would help me start over. I had nowhere to go, no memory of anyone. So when he offered to help, I accepted." Natalie held her breath, trying to imagine what Christopher had gone through all that time while she searched desperately for him. "He brought me here to this farm," Christopher explained, looking around the house. "Slowly, I began to live a new life. I didn't know who I was before the accident, but I learned how to live here. Years later, I met Aaron, a boy who also needed a family. I decided to adopt him. He gave me company, and together we formed something like a family." He paused for a moment, looking at Natalie with a sad expression. "I've always had this feeling that there was more to my life before the accident, like something was missing, but I could never remember anything." Christopher's words hit Natalie deeply. He hadn't left because he wanted to. He had lost everything, his memory, his past, and the love they had shared. And she, for so many years, had believed that he had left her on purpose. Natalie took a deep breath, knowing what was coming next would be hard but necessary. She looked at Christopher, the man she loved, who was so close, yet still so far away. "Christopher," she began, her voice soft and filled with emotion. "We weren't strangers before this accident. We were engaged. We were about to get married, to build a life together. You disappeared 25 years ago without a trace. I spent all that time searching for you." Christopher looked at her, surprised, trying to process what she was saying. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You didn't leave me. It wasn't your choice," Natalie continued, her eyes glistening with tears. "That accident you mentioned. I never knew what happened. One day you were with me, and the next you were gone. It was like the ground disappeared beneath my feet." She picked up the photo she had brought and showed it to Christopher again. "This photo was taken by you on that day on the swing, the same place as the one on your wall. It was one of our happiest moments. You always said this picture would be a reminder of our love." Christopher looked at the photo again, squinting his eyes, trying to remember. It was as if he felt something, a connection, but he still couldn't see everything clearly. "I know it's hard for you now, but I'm here to help," said Natalie, her voice growing stronger. "We had a life together. We had plans, dreams, and now, after all these years, I've finally found you." He lowered his eyes, taking a deep breath. "I want to remember," he said, with a tone of desperation. "I feel like there's something there, something locked inside me, but I just can't reach it." Natalie gently touched Christopher's hand. "You don't have to do this alone. I'm here. We'll figure this out together." Over the next few days, as they talked, Christopher began having small flashes of his past, like loose fragments of a story he couldn't fully piece together. Sometimes they were brief moments, like an image of Natalie smiling at him, or the sound of her laughter as they walked together. Other times, he remembered details like the smell of fresh coffee on the mornings they spent together, or the gentle touch of her hands. "Christopher, do you remember anything?" Natalie asked, full of hope each time he mentioned these small fragments. "I see some things, faces, places, but it's all very confusing," Christopher replied, a tone of frustration in his voice. I remember you, but it's like everything's blurry, like I'm trying to look at something far away through a dirty window. Natalie smiled, despite the pain, trying to stay optimistic. This is a start. You're beginning to remember. It'll take time, but I'm here with you like I always have been. Even with these small glimpses, much of Christopher's life remained a mystery to him. It was as if there was a barrier, something blocking his deeper memories. He wanted so badly to remember everything, to be the person Natalie knew, but the emptiness was still there, leaving him feeling frustrated. I know it's not easy, Natalie said tenderly, but these pieces you're getting back already mean so much. We'll keep trying. I'll help you remember who you were, who we were. Christopher looked at her, filled with both gratitude and sadness. I just want to be who I was. For you. For us. Natalie squeezed his hand gently. You already are, Christopher. We'll find our way back. On a quiet afternoon, Natalie decided to visit her brother, Jonathan. She needed to talk, to share everything that had happened with Christopher and the mystery still surrounding his disappearance. Jonathan welcomed her into his home, as he always did, but there was something different in his eyes, as if he knew this conversation would be more serious. Jonathan, I found Christopher, Natalie said, her voice firm but filled with emotion. Jonathan looked at her, surprised. Christopher? Your fiancé who disappeared all those years ago. How is that possible? She explained everything, how she had found him on the farm, the accident that made him lose his memory, and the fragments of memories he was beginning to recover. But something still didn't make sense to her, and that was why she had come to talk to Jonathan. He didn't leave by choice, Jonathan. He had an accident, lost his memory, and the strangest thing is, a man found him in the hospital and took him to the farm. But I can't understand why no one told me anything at the time. Jonathan, who had been listening in silence until then, seemed uncomfortable. He avoided looking directly at her, fidgeting with his hands, nervous. Jonathan, do you know something I don't? Natalie asked, noticing her brother's strange behavior. He hesitated for a few seconds before letting out a deep sigh. Nat, there's something I never told you, something our father did, and I never knew how to talk about it. Natalie felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean, Jonathan? What does Dad have to do with Christopher's disappearance? Jonathan lowered his head, the guilt weighing heavily on his shoulders. It was Dad, Natalie. He was behind everything. He never liked Christopher. He always thought he wasn't good enough for you. Dad had plans for you. He wanted you to marry someone from an important family. When he realized you were determined to marry Christopher, he made a terrible decision. Natalie was in shock, with both pain and anger rising inside her. What are you saying, Jonathan? Dad did this. He was responsible for the disappearance of the man I loved. Jonathan, with tears welling in his eyes, nodded. Yes, Nat. Dad orchestrated the accident. He planned everything to get Christopher away from you. He thought he was doing what was best for our family's future. Natalie stood up abruptly, her heart racing. He destroyed my life, Jonathan. He made me believe that Christopher had abandoned me, and it was all because of pride? Jonathan remained silent, unable to respond to the pain he saw in his sister's eyes. Natalie was in shock after Jonathan's revelation. It was hard to believe that her own father, George, had orchestrated Christopher's disappearance. She needed to understand why. Jonathan's words echoed in her mind, but they didn't make sense. How could the father she had always respected have done something so cruel? Jonathan, tell me why he did this, Natalie said, her voice trembling but firm. Why did Dad hate Christopher so much, just because he didn't come from a wealthy family? Jonathan sighed deeply, visibly uncomfortable. Dad was always very strict about the idea of status and family, Natalie. He believed you deserved someone who was on the same financial and social level as our family. Christopher, he was a simple guy, a hard worker, but in Dad's eyes that wasn't enough. Natalie shook her head in disbelief. That's ridiculous. I loved Christopher, and he made me happy. That should have been enough. Jonathan looked at her with sadness. Dad never understood that, Nat. He thought Christopher was distracting you from a promising future, from something bigger. He wanted you to marry someone who could uphold the family's reputation. He believed that by taking Christopher out of your life, you'd follow the path he had planned for you. But he was wrong. Natalie felt the anger growing inside her. So to him, status, money were more important than my happiness. He destroyed my life over some ridiculous prejudice against someone he thought wasn't good enough. Jonathan lowered his head, ashamed of what he was revealing. Yes, Natalie, he thought he was protecting you, but he ended up destroying everything. Natalie took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears that were starting to form. Christopher never deserved this. He was good, he was honest, and he loved me. And Dad, out of pride and prejudice, decided he had the right to control our fate. He stole 25 years of our life. Natalie could no longer hold back the anger she felt. Jonathan's revelations were too much for her. After so many years of suffering, finding out that her own brother had known everything and done nothing made her even more furious. She looked at Jonathan, her face full of hurt and indignation. "You knew the whole time, Jonathan? And you didn't tell me anything?" Natalie asked, her voice firm but full of pain. Jonathan took a deep breath, the weight of guilt clear on his face. "Natalie, I knew part of the story, yes, but it was complicated. Dad believed he was doing what was best for you and for our family. He made me promise never to say anything. He said it was necessary." "Necessary?" Natalie repeated in disbelief. "You think destroying my life and Christopher's was necessary? You really believed this was the right thing to do?" Jonathan shook his head, trying to find the right words. "Natalie, I never wanted you to suffer, but Dad, he was always strict. He thought that without Christopher you would have a better future. Dad was obsessed with the idea that you should marry someone of status, someone who could bring more power. So because of this sick obsession with power, you both decided to play with my life?" Natalie asked, her voice now full of pain. "You watched everything happen, Jonathan. You saw my suffering, saw how I searched for Christopher for years, and you did nothing." Jonathan seemed even more uncomfortable now, knowing he had no excuses. "I tried to talk to Dad a few times, but he wouldn't listen. He was stubborn, Natalie. He believed he was doing what was right, and I didn't know how to act. I didn't want to betray his trust." Natalie, her eyes filled with tears, responded in a broken voice, "Betray his trust? What about me, Jonathan? I'm your sister. How could you let me believe that Christopher had abandoned me, that he had simply disappeared from my life by choice? You destroyed any chance of happiness I could have had." Jonathan lowered his head, speechless. He knew that no matter how much he tried to justify his actions, what had been done could never be undone. When Natalie told Christopher the whole truth, he was completely devastated. He listened in silence as she explained how her father, George, had planned his disappearance out of pride and prejudice. Christopher couldn't believe that the life he had lost, the memories and love he shared with Natalie, had been stolen by such a cruel decision. Christopher stood up, running his hands through his hair, clearly shaken. "So all of this, my life, our future together, was destroyed because of a stupid idea about status?" His voice trembled, full of pain. "I lost 25 years, Natalie, so many years that I will never get back." Natalie, tears in her eyes, tried to find the right words. "I'm so sorry, Christopher. I lost those years too. I searched for you all that time, but I never knew what had really happened until now." Christopher took a deep breath, fighting the anger and sadness inside him. He wanted to scream, to cry, but he knew it wouldn't bring back the lost time. I need to understand how this happened. I need answers, Natalie. I can't move on without knowing the details, without understanding how George managed to do this." Natalie looked at him, understanding his need for answers. "I'll help you, Christopher. We'll find out everything together." Christopher, hurt and confused, knew he needed to uncover the full truth. He couldn't move forward until he knew how one man's pride and prejudice had been able to destroy 2 lives. Christopher was determined to get answers, and with a heavy heart went to confront Jonathan. He needed to understand exactly how everything had happened. When he arrived, Jonathan already knew the conversation would be difficult. "Jonathan, I know what your father did, but I need to know all the details. I can't move on without it," Christopher said, with a serious and pained expression. Jonathan, visibly uncomfortable, took a deep breath before starting to speak. "Christopher, I wanted to tell you before, but I was bound by my father's orders. George always thought you weren't good enough for Natalie, and it drove him to obsess over getting you out of the picture. Christopher listened in silence, but his anger and pain were growing with every word. Jonathan continued, "At first he started giving you medication, mixed into your food, that slowly affected your memory. He wanted to make you seem confused, distracted, so you would distance yourself from Natalie on your own." Christopher frowned, incredulous. "Medication? He manipulated my mind without me even knowing." Jonathan nodded sadly. "Yes, he did that for a while. When he realized it wasn't enough that you were still by Natalie's side, he staged that accident. It was all planned. George made it look like you had suffered a serious accident, and that's how he got you out of the way." Christopher felt the ground fall out from under him. "So, he did all of it? The accident, my memory loss, my disappearance, it was all part of his plan?" Jonathan lowered his head, ashamed. "Yes. Dad arranged for you to be taken far away, to never return. He thought he was protecting Natalie and her future. He believed that without you, she would marry someone more suitable." Christopher was furious and heartbroken at the same time. "He destroyed my life, Jonathan, and not just mine, Natalie's too." Jonathan looked at him full of regret. "I know, and I never should have stayed silent. Dad did terrible things and I didn't stop him. I'm so sorry, Christopher." But Jonathan's apologies couldn't erase the years of suffering Christopher had endured. After discovering the whole truth, Christopher knew he couldn't change the past, but he was determined to rebuild his life. With Natalie's support, he began undergoing treatments to try and recover his memory. It was a slow and difficult process, but he was committed to moving forward, one step at a time. Natalie stood by him through every appointment, every therapy session. She encouraged him to keep going, even on the days when everything seemed impossible. "You don't need to remember everything at once, Christopher. What matters is that we're here, together now," she said tenderly, holding his hand. Slowly, small pieces of the past began to come back. Sometimes they were just fragments, a smile, a conversation, a trip they had taken together. Other times he had dreams that felt more like memories, happy moments he and Natalie had shared before the accident. Yet, much was still missing. But instead of focusing on what was lost, Christopher decided to focus on the present. He knew he wasn't alone. Besides Natalie, he now had Aaron, the son he had adopted, who brought him joy and comfort during his years of loneliness. They had formed a new family, different from what he and Natalie had planned in the past, but perhaps even stronger for all they had faced. Aaron, who had always been a calm and supportive presence, helped both Christopher and Natalie in every way. "Dad, it doesn't matter what happened before. What matters is that we're together now," he said simply, but with great affection. Over time, Christopher began to find peace. He might not remember everything, but he was creating new memories with Natalie and Aaron. Every day was an opportunity to rebuild his life and reconnect with the love that he and Natalie had never truly lost. Natalie felt a sense of relief and renewal that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Knowing that Christopher had never truly abandoned her brought a peace to her heart she thought she would never feel again. For years, she had carried the weight of abandonment, believing he had simply disappeared, leaving her alone and without explanation. But now, everything was clear. He hadn't left by choice. Instead, he had been the victim of a cruel plan, and this truth made all the difference for Natalie. The love they had never died. Despite all the suffering and all the years of uncertainty, Christopher was still the man she loved and who had always loved her. She looked at him, sitting beside her with a soft smile. "I spent so much time thinking you had left me. But now I know that our love was always alive. It never went away," Natalie said, her voice gentle but full of emotion. Christopher held her hand, a simple gesture, but one that meant so much to them. "I never wanted to leave you, Natalie. If I had the choice, I would have stayed by your side from the very first day." Natalie smiled, tears shining in her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief, not pain. She felt that now at last she could breathe again. The pain she had carried for so long was beginning to fade, making way for hope and a future alongside Christopher, with Aaron as a family. She felt renewed, full of strength and hope, ready to build something new alongside the man who had always been her great love. Natalie and Christopher knew that time had passed, but they also knew that the love between them was still strong, perhaps even stronger now after everything they had been through. They couldn't go back and recover the lost years, but they could do something even more important: build a future together, leaving behind the pain and shadows of the past. On a quiet afternoon, sitting in the farm's garden, Natalie looked at Christopher and smiled. "We've been through so much, Christopher, but I think we still have a lot to live together. Maybe not the way we dreamed before, but in a new way." Christopher smiled back, his eyes shining with affection. "I think so too, Natalie. The past will always be part of us, but it doesn't have to define our future." She took his hand and said, with a resolve that came from deep within her heart, "So let's pick up where we left off. Let's live what we couldn't before. I want us to get married, Christopher, like we should have so many years ago." Christopher was silent for a moment, moved by her words. "I want that too, Nat, more than anything." Even though they were older now, with grey hair and the weight of the years on their shoulders, Natalie and Christopher felt a new energy. They decided they would finally get married and start this new chapter together, with Aaron now as part of their family. It didn't matter what they had lost, they still had so much to gain with each other. In that moment, the two of them realized that life was still offering them a chance for happiness. It didn't matter how much time had passed. What mattered was the love they shared and their decision to face the future together, as they always should have. And so, with their hearts full of hope, they left the past behind, ready to build a new beginning.